I'm Amy Dickens. I'm a GitHub campus rep. I'm also a researcher in user experience design for the Mixed Reality Laboratory at the University of Nottingham. And I also am the founder of a company called My Kind of Tech, which focuses on inclusivity in technology events for underrepresented groups. So I do a lot of work across many spectrums that talk about accessibility, people's different needs, different cultures. I'm one of those people that traverses creative and technological worlds. I started out as a musician, got an undergrad in audio engineering, ended up coming over to a PhD in computer science. Don't ask me how, I don't know. So that's where I'm at today. And at the weekends, you'll find me doing stuff like this. This was me judging Sex Tech Hack, which was a hackathon on sex technologies and making them more accessible and usable by all different kinds of people. And was one of the events held at a university in London. So I do a lot of wide range of things, and that makes me a bit of a strange body of knowledge. I can dabble in code, I can dabble in design, I can be somebody who judges at hackathons, and I do public speaking a lot like this as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about like user experience design, but specifically for people with disabilities and accessibility requirements. And I'm talking about that in the context of my research, which is in digital musical instruments, so accessible instruments for people with disabilities. And to talk about that, I'm going to take you through 4 different things. So I'm going to look at affordances. What are they? What's that term used for in user experience design? Why do we use it, and why are they so important? I'm going to talk about methods. So I'm going to talk about user experience design, or as we call it, UX design methods. I'm going to talk about a case study, which is my research. And also, I'm going to be looking at top tips for accessibility into technology. So before we start, I want to talk about statistics. There are a number of people that live in the world with a known disability. And I'd like everybody to consider this question, like how many people do you think are living in the world with a disability? Is it somebody you know? Maybe you have a friend of a friend, somebody you know of that lives with a disability. And I want to see, like, if you're able to raise your hand, how many people would hazard a guess that that's under 10% of the population? Okay. Under 20%? Okay. It's actually, if my clicker works, 19%. So 19% of like working age adults, this is where that comes about. And this figure is kind of a bit tricky because when you look at it from different angles, the number is actually quite large, 1.3 billion people. But you can't necessarily rely on that data because that's asking people who have disclosed a disability. And much with mental health status and many other things, there's a lot of stigma that's attached to actually disclosing that information. And there's a lot of people that might not disclose unless they have an absolute requirement that means that they need to access via a specific route or something else. They might try and hide it as much as they can for fear of it making them weaker, or all of these kind of tarred brushes that we see with a lot of talks, well, a lot of like the stigma around mental health and disability. But how do we reach that percentage of people? So in your design, if you're actually designing for any product, whether it's web or hardware or software, when you're designing, you're actually losing that 19% of people if you don't design for accessibility. If you don't think that your users are those people, then you're actually only presenting to, what, like 81% of the market. And it's kind of interesting because when you make something accessible for people with needs, you actually make it more accessible for everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that we would do to understand the needs of users with disabilities in this kind of user experience design sphere. So I'm going to talk about affordances. What are affordances? It's a very sort of academic term. It came out through sociological history. It was, I think, J.J. Gibson. And they refer to it as like actionable properties between the world and an actor. So the thing that makes you know how to interact with something. So affordances can actually be many, many things. And this is a term that was actually popularized in the design of everyday things by Don Norman. So it's typically something that gets the user's attention and implies a function. So do people know what to do based on what they see? And when you're looking at web design, that's really, really prevalent. But when you're looking into other products, perhaps you're assuming some knowledge of users, you're presenting for different levels, sometimes those affordances can get lost and aren't as clear as we would expect them to be. So I'm going to take a typical example here just to make it really explicit. This is a door. We talk about doors a lot when we're talking about affordances. We know a lot about doors from just looking at them, and this handle tells me that I'm likely to maybe twist it and push it open instead of pull it towards me. It's got a lock, so I know that I can lock it. These are the things that I implicitly know just from looking at the door. And I actually have lots of comments about my university campus because we have handles on all the push doors. And everybody I see at least 2 or 3 times a day pulls the door and gets like jammed. And we also have push signs on doors that can open both ways. So it doesn't matter whether you push or pull it. So why have a sign that says push? It's just really bizarre because sometimes it might be better if you could access from either way. And not making that implicit means that people get confused by what you're presenting. So in design, when we talk about these kind of affordances, some of the things that we might think about are things like readability. And in readability, we typically think of things like this. We default to typography and colors and options of colors and how the design actually looks. But what we actually need to think about is how does that read and how is it accessible for perhaps a screen reader? How accessible is it for somebody who might have to have some kind of filter placed on top of that text? How is it that your typography, whatever you might have spent hours on doing some nice design work, does it look nice in every context? And if you change the colors, is that going to be completely lost on someone? There's actually loads of tools, loads of them on the web for accessible color choices in your web design. Specifically, what accessibility rating score you get from mixing different colors together, and also how they work well with different filters. So you can go out there and find there's really no excuse for having unreadable text for certain people with different visual impairments. In the same way, we need to think about readability in terms of screen readers. So there's a couple of do's and don'ts when you're designing for a screen reader. Hang on. Clicker's gone, okay. Do consider your layout. Arrange the content so it can be read correctly by screen readers. Screen readers typically will do the thing where it takes the content left to right, top to bottom. Anything that comes in there, it will read the whole thing. If there's a link in your references, it will read the whole link out. If there's a picture, it will read the image name out. So on that note, don't use HTML tags to style things specifically. Edit within your CSS if you're going to do that. So your cascading style sheets, don't arrange content or make content look like other content because you want it to have the same styling. Don't make something a header so it can have, for instance, oh, it looks the same as this, unless that thing is a header. Because when you go through that page and when you navigate it with keyboard functions as well, by assigning it as a header when it might not be that, you just wanted it to have the bigger font or the specific size that's maybe assigned to a H3 tag or a H1. Like, those things mean that you will end up having an out-of-order reading on a screen reader, or perhaps something read out as a header that isn't, because it will tell the user what it is when it reads it as well. Do use full descriptive names for images and add alternative text where possible. If you use a specific graphic on a website, and you've got that from maybe a free image source or something else, it might have this ridiculously long name that you thought it was perfectly fine to have in your web file because nobody sees the file name, right? Or you know that you've called it girl with dog. Like, that makes sense to you, but that name might not necessarily give the full description to the user. So is the girl sat there petting the dog? Is the girl walking the dog? Like, what is happening in that picture, and what can you tell the user about it within the name. When you add alternative text, you add a further description, and that can really help for some people who might not be completely relying on a screen reader, but want to be able to load the page without the images. And don't use shortcuts on correct pronunciation. So this is something that screen readers do. If you give it a name of a tech company or something that we all have like collectively learned how to pronounce it, and it pronounces it in a funny way, don't be tempted to use like ARIA text, which is an accessibility feature, to then correct that by making it phonetic. When you do that, it might make it sound better on the screen reader, but what it actually does is it outputs the alternative text that you've entered, which looks like gibberish. It also outputs that on Braille readers. So for people who are using Braille instead of the screen reader, and they might be using that would seem like nonsensical, like why have I got this random word that's made up of vowel sounds in there? Like, so those are good practices to do. Another thing that you need to think about when we're talking about accessibility in design of products is focus. So focus refers to the keyboard focus, so elements that are controllable by your keyboard input. You can access focus quite commonly on most laptops. You can also like use them within web pages and web browsers, but there are some keys that like are the controller keys there. So commonly the tab and shift tab keys are like reserved for changing focus. And when you have a web page or an app or whatever you might have, you have tab order. So tab order is the order that the elements are put into. And if you don't have things arranged in your coding script in the way that it will end up being in the right place on the tab order, even if, like with web elements, it's easy to use CSS to place something somewhere else on the page, but leave it in the web script, in the HTML, in the same location. By doing that, you're causing this disconnect, and when somebody tabs through your web page, they might go across, 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 and then down here on your page. And it can be really interruptive to their experience. You want people to experience navigation as if they were using a mouse, as if they were just looking at that page and navigating where you'd expect their gaze to go. If your tab order is out of sync, you're going to end up with people going like all over the shop and feeling very like, I don't know how to get from A to B. And for somebody who uses keyboard input as their only input, that's going to make them go, I can't use this website because I don't know how to get back. I don't know what's the clear steps. Again, using your headings for this and links and making sure everything is in the correct order is really important. So we also have focus in visual navigation. So this is a video of tracking somebody's gaze when using a Google search and also using YouTube. And this is the kind of technology that people use for testing their things to find out what grabs users' attention, but also it can be used as a control mechanism for somebody who isn't able to use mouse or keyboard input. So it's really important to understand where you're putting the focus of your elements on things within a software product or within a web application. You need to consider this focus for eye trackers as a control mechanism. Use emphasis in the right places, so don't try and draw attention, especially like advertisers are the worst for this because they'll grab your screen page and like grab attention. And that can make it really difficult for a user if they keep glancing over because they need to hold on an element for a certain amount of time to be able to select it. And then consider how the interaction might change when using an eye tracker. Is there going to be any control mechanisms that won't work the same way? Are you going to navigate using maybe the on-screen keyboard? Is that going to cause any issues for you? We have really great eye tracking resources and head movements and motions in virtual reality technologies. And it's just kind of a clear example where technologies get explored mainly for the able-bodied user. So when you come across anything like this and you're seeing a new input mechanism or a control, think about how it actually might benefit users for your product where they might have access needs. So there are so many affordances of new technologies, and they're seldom explored for disabled users. Like the potential of putting somebody in a virtual world where they can have the interactions of an able-bodied user and can place things in a visual line and can even mimic hands is amazing. And we rarely get to see advances in disabled technologies for that. We also think about people who might have a hearing disability. So hearing impairments are like any other disability. There is a spectrum. It's not just, are you deaf? Can you hear? There is so many in-betweens and so many gray areas. I work with young people with profound multiple learning difficulties, and what's quite common in my work is I see people who have cochlear implants. Cochlear implants are where some implants have been placed in the brain, and there is technology that sits outside the user's skull, and it attaches via a magnet, and it helps to transduce different sounds. It just processes signals and kind of helps the person who's got the implant perceive sound in some way. However, they aren't going to give somebody the experience of full able hearing. What they do can be kind of interruptive for certain frequencies. So with cochlear implants, I work with music tech, so I actually see this quite a lot. There are frequencies and certain sounds that you best to avoid using because they actually can either be painful or irritating for somebody who's got this implant. And with the students that I work with, the non-vocal ones tend to knock their implant off when I'm doing something that is irritating them. So you need to look for keys and signals in your technology that might cause those kind of interrupts. Also, try to provide closed captioning for everything that needs to be heard to be understood. So I've been to quite a few events, and where I've seen it done really well is having like TVs down the rows with closed captioning on and doing live closed captioning, but that's not always an option. And if you want to provide something that's video context or anything that you're going to place on the web that you would need some kind of audio description, try to provide that. If you can, try to provide it by doing it yourself. Placing reliance on algorithms can be a huge risk. I don't know if anybody's watched any of the YouTube fails of the algorithm getting completely wrong what's being said in the video, and that can have some kind of really bad effects for people who are putting the videos out there. And if you can, provide in advance your transcript, because then that can be given to somebody who's has a hearing impairment within your audience or on your website. We also have different affordances we need to think of for people with limited mobility. So there are a number of things you might need to adapt in technology, and it's not just screen placements or adapted keyboards. There's actually a really famous comic about a disability where a person is a group of school-age children, and the one person is in a wheelchair at the front of a school that's got snow all covered over the steps and the ramp and stuff. And there's some able-bodied students and there's a person in a wheelchair, and the janitor is shoveling off the stairs. And the person in the wheelchair points out that if you shoveled the ramp, then everybody would be able to use it. And that's another clear thing of, if you create an access point for somebody with an access need, you're actually making it 100% more reachable for somebody who doesn't. And so that really, really breaks into your audience. We also have hidden disabilities. So this is just an overview that I'm giving you at the moment. So these are primarily neurological and can cover things like autism spectrum disorders, mental health issues, fatigue, chronic pain, sleep disorders, attention deficit, and yeah, it's not limited to all those things. There's actually loads more. And there are things that you can do within your product that help with these. So managing the way you present information is the best thing that you can do in this scenario. For those with ASD, actually storifying content and actions can really, really help, because a lot of the social context is lost. for people with autism spectrum disorders. And maybe if you are thinking, again, for visual things, for people who might have a neurological sleep disorder, for instance, they might avoid blue light at all times. And that might mean that they put a filter on everything. And again, that's going to be something visibility-wise you're going to have to account for. And avoid asking users as well for prolonged and difficult to produce gestures. You need to make things simple if you're going to make them accessible, and having something that you have to repeatedly do and is kind of difficult to produce will end up making it really inaccessible for somebody. In essence, when we're thinking about user experience and people with disabilities, we are now in an age of personalization. So the best thing that we can do for users is maximize this and give them as many options as possible to tailor a product to their needs. A simple change in your UI by having a color change option or a color change button on your website for people with sighting issues, that's a huge step towards making it more accessible for people. But it seems like such a small thing that you can do within your website. So now I'd like to talk about some methods that you might use. So methods that we use in user experience design. How do you find out who your users are and what you need to give them? Well, you do research like I'm doing. And this can be anything from looking at archives of produced reports on disability or a specific area or a specific group of people that you're trying to access, looking at the most up-to-date recent reporting on that, holding focus groups to call anybody that uses your technology in and asking them what their requirements are, doing online surveys, and everybody's favorite buzzword at the minute, big data, looking at what's already out there and trying to fashion some kind of idea and do some analytics to find out what this tells us. The most interesting research sometimes can just become from observing the most mundane interactions, because it's not like the edge cases that you want to capture here. It's like, oh, how does everybody approach this thing? How is there potentially a barrier for somebody who has an accessibility need? You can also use things like technology probes. This is something that I regularly do in my research. And these are simple pieces of technology that can focus on a particular need or a particular group or a particular product and put them in front of users in a real-world setting. So we talk about the wild a lot, and this isn't what we mean by that, obviously. We mean placing things in front of people in the public sphere. And if you're doing that with your technology, if you're expecting your users to be of the general public nature, then you are going to encounter somebody with a disability, and that is just a fact. That if you're not designing for that, you're isolating them from being able to engage with your product. And that's just not very fair, in my opinion, and I think in everybody's. In trying to find out more about these users, we do UX testing. And a lot of people might get this memo from their line manager. I run a usability test, and what does that actually mean? It means a lot of things. You can do things called GOMS analysis, which is Goals, Operators, Methods, Selection testing, but be very aware that they don't account for a personalized user. They account for somebody being able to achieve something, or like the, not expert user, but intermediate user. They assume some knowledge. They assume a user that can use a keyboard that can do this. But that gives you some kind of quantifiable information about how long it might take a user to do X task. You can do things like fail and break testing. You can invite a bunch of people in and ask them to break your thing. You know, the thing that you spent ages building and you felt like a hero when you made it work? You can ask them to come in and break it and find all the points where bug errors and all the things that might annoy you will happen. Because the earlier on you find those problems, the better a product you're going to have. And if you can do many iterations of that, you're going to end up with a committed user group who understand how everything works. You also get exploratory studies, which are a lot more like just sitting a user down with your product and going, use the thing. or giving them a task and saying, can you do this? Or just letting them, at their own will, experience your product and seeing where they go with it. In similar vein, this is where people tend to get eye trackers involved and use eye tracking sessions. If you are going to do eye tracking sessions, you may as well try and add the control element in there as well, because then you're counting for the accessibility testing. So you can also use personas. Perhaps you can't bring your users in, perhaps there isn't budget, perhaps you're a very small startup and you don't know really what to do to branch out, or you don't necessarily have a company that you can get user research through. Then develop some personas for the people that you expect to be using your product, but be very warned because you might inherently create biases by doing that. So user personas can only go so far. When you need to get real data about your app, your product, you really, really need to engage with the people who are on the ground. And always, always try to include accessibility checks. Try and walk through your thing with just the keyboard. Try and put it on a screen reader. Have you ever tried to use a screen reader on an iPad? Anybody here? It's horrendous. It reads out all of the functions, and then a hover gesture or a single touch is to read out the thing. So a double tap then becomes the thing to interact. So if you have a product that has a double tap to interact with something, then you have to think of, is that a triple tap now because I don't want to hover over it? You have to think about what that actually does. And sometimes they can read through them at crazy speeds as well. So also think about every element you name in your application on an iPad. If you name something in an abbreviation, for instance, I work a lot with audio apps, channel is often abbreviated to CHNL. On a screen reader, that just sounds like channel. Like, it doesn't make much sense unless the context is there. So if somebody stumbles into your environment completely by accident and they're using a screen reader, they're going to feel really, really obscurely out of, like an outsider, because they don't have a clue what's going on, because the object isn't visual to them and they can only hear what the object is named. So these are really, really interesting things to do when you're coming and building products for people with accessibility needs. You can also use user feedback mechanisms. So this is very common. We do surveys online or in person. We get ratings in our app stores and scream when we get like a really good tech website review. We do user interviews that are either naturalistic or structured. Now, this means, do you bring the user in for a cup of tea and have a sit-down conversation with them just as if you were like catching up? Or do you bring them in with a set of questions about the goals that you want to know? Because if you do either or, you might get different answers. With structured interviews, it's really important not to ask leading questions, because you might just reaffirm the thing that you thought by having designed the questions that way. You're not actually getting the true data from that user. You're not letting them tell you, this is how I experience something, if you're asking them in a specific manner. And again, focus groups. So they're so important for iterations on a product. Try and get a community of users that you know can evaluate your product and really test it to its limits. These are things that you can really benefit from when you're designing anything. And so let's have a look at a case study from my research, which is accessible digital musical instruments, which is a mouthful. I call them DMIs to shorten it, but nobody knows what I'm going on about, and everybody in tech loves acronyms, so I try not to do too many of those. So, digital musical instruments and accessibility. What does that mean? Well, I help people who have profound multiple learning difficulties, complex disabilities, things like cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy. Most of the users I interact with are wheelchair-bound, non-vocal, and we're using the experience and time for them to engage with a creative activity. The design that I want to be able to encourage is that they can create their own music, perform their own music in front of crowds, and evaluate that music, and give feedback as well. And many people would put assumptions on that user group, that they don't experience things in the same way, or maybe they can't perform, or maybe they can't do these things. But I've taken a group of 16 young people and performed on the stage at the Royal Albert Hall for the BBC Proms. They've performed with a Philharmonic Orchestra, and that's something that not many artists can claim that they've done, even when they've hit the charts. So there is definitely a place for this kind of technology. And most people think of a digital instrument as this kind of thing. So a keyboard with some augmented stuff, maybe. But actually, it's a lot more like iPad apps, gesture controllers, conductive paint, touch boards, anything where we can generate signal, we can turn that signal into sound. So my task is to build a DMI that can be used by people with disabilities. And in essence, this means that I go through this cycle of meeting a user, giving them a thing, learning their barriers to the thing, and then trying to adapt that thing and go in an iterative cycle. And then that branches out into doing more stuff like observing and writing and kind of identifying areas and adapting and finding out what I can't change about something. And these are the things that I found generally. The most important things are, can the thing withstand a drop? Is it robust? Can we eliminate the risk of cables? Can it be wireless technology? Can the user manipulate the thing? And is there a direct relationship between the input and output of the thing? Can they make sense of that causality? Can they understand that I moved this and it created that sound over there? Because there can be a weird spectrum with a lot of electronic music. Most people, you know, for all intents and purposes, you could be watching somebody and they could be checking their emails. You don't know what they're doing on that laptop. So the system requirements for this was, can it be wireless? So I thought about using the Raspberry Pi and being able to put that with a battery pack and enclose it in something so it could be used and get data from it. And to do that, we wanted to create a gesture relationship between input and output, so the causality. So I use the Enviro hat and the Unicorn Pi hat, because the Enviro hat will get the data on the gesture, and the Unicorn hat I can display light changes for those gestures, so I can give a visual cue as well as an audible cue. And then can the user manipulate the thing? Well, this is where it got interesting, because I accidentally got given I got given a gift at Christmas that had some kind of face mask inside a see-through bauble, and I had to crack open the bauble to get to it, and I thought, the Raspberry Pi fits perfectly in here. And I did away with the face mask, and I thought, well, this is great, because it's a cheap, minimum viable product. I can encase it in this, I can cover it in something like silicone so it won't do this when I drop it, and I can make a gesture controller that can output data and make sound. And so I had to put it together, and this is kind of how it looks as a system diagram. So we have everything that's in the bauble over this side, the Raspberry Pi, the data exchange with a Python script, and then that gets sent into my MacBook Pro, which I'm converting the data in Max for Live, which is Max MSP is a visual IDE used by a lot of musicians, and that goes into Ableton Live, and I have sound output from the laptop, and I have visual output from the thing. So I get some nice stuff happening, and it feels really fun. And there's going to be a blog post on it that I'm going to share with you, because I didn't bring the thing with me for reasons. And the last thing I really want to leave with you is my A11Y. We use this shortening for accessibility. There's 11 letters between the A and the Y, or from the A to the Y. So my A11Y top tips. I would advise that you connect with your community of users for user experience testing. I would have not known any of those things or had those experiences had I not been in many of these musical sessions with these young people. Never assume who they are or their likes or behavior. This is very dangerous territory. Don't assume it's very easy for everybody to see that big red button, because it's not. Keep up to date with changes in accessibility tools. There's a really good podcast by Rob Dodson for web development, which is on the Google Chrome Developers YouTube channel, and that's got loads of tools about setting focus and using things for screen readers and other things. Remember that your team are not your average users. So if you're a startup and you're in a room full of people who look like you and act like you and are the same, more or less, apart from perhaps interests or hobbies, then you're not going to be representing your true user group. To have a true representation on your team, you would need to have people not just of all different races and religions and things like that, but you would need people who like rock music to pop music and classical to heavy metal. Like, you would need people who have different personalities. And the thing that divides those users is just general population. So you need to go out to those people and reach them. And build for accessibility even when you don't think it's needed. Because you'll surprise yourself in the fact that there is somebody out there who needs to access your thing, and when they can, it makes somebody so much happier because their daily life choices are not usually under their control. If they can interact with a thing and control a thing, then it makes it so much better for them. And this is my mantra, is that accessibility should be a foundation that we build upon, not a feature that you add later, as many of us have to do. And it's a lot more difficult if you try to do that, believe me, because you have to reinvent the wheel. So that's me. Thank you. Tweet me, follow me, email me, and get in touch. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you.